This is the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and his legendary voyage of survival in the Antarctic. It begins in January 1915, when Shackleton and his crew of 28 men found themselves trapped in the drifting ice of the Weddell Sea. For more than 600 days, they would endure unimaginable hardships. Hunger, storms, and the destruction of their ship, the Endurance. But this tale is not only about struggle. It is about leadership, courage, and the unbreakable will to bring every man home alive. From Shackleton's early failures as a young explorer, to his bold expeditions toward the South Pole, and finally his daring rescue across the most dangerous seas on Earth, this story reveals why he is remembered not for reaching the pole, but for saving his men. It is a journey through glory and loss, hope and despair, survival and redemption. Sparkles now. Let us dive into the full story in detail, the incredible saga of endurance and the man who would not let his crew perish in the white hell of Antarctica. Part 1. Into the white hell on a January day in 1915. Far from the warmth of any human settlement, 28 men stood upon the deck of their ship and watched the sea freeze around them. The vessel, a proud wooden craft named Endurance, was being swallowed by a world of shifting ice. The sound was not like the sea they knew, with its restless waves and endless motion. Instead, it was a chorus of groans, cracks, and deep echoing booms, as if the very earth had decided to seize and imprison them. For these men, this was no ordinary voyage. They were part of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, an era when the world's bravest and most curious souls sought to plant flags on the last untouched corners of the globe. The Arctic had been mapped. The highest peaks had been climbed. Only Antarctica, vast and unyielding, remained a stage for daring and discovery. But the Antarctic was no ordinary frontier. It was a land of perpetual ice, winds that howled like 1,000 voices, and temperatures so low that breath froze in the air. To approach it was to court danger. To survive it was to bend human will against nature's harshest trials. And to dream of crossing it from one side to the other was a goal so ambitious it bordered on madness. At the head of this journey stood Sir Ernest Shackleton. He was not the tallest nor the strongest of men, but he possessed something rarer, a steady presence that drew loyalty from all who knew him. His eyes carried both a restless fire and a calm reassurance, as if he could see storms ahead but had already planned the way through them. He had been to the Antarctic before. He knew its beauty and its cruelty, and still he had returned, chasing a dream no one had yet dared attempt, to march clear across the frozen continent, from one ocean to the other. The world into which these men had sailed was already shifting in ways none could fully grasp. In Europe, armies clashed in what would become the Great War, a conflict of trenches, machines, and terrible new weapons. Many of Shackleton's men had wondered if they should stay and fight. Yet they were told that theirs was also a noble duty, that in their journey, the spirit of exploration, courage, and science would endure. And so they sailed southward into waters no cannon could reach, toward a battlefield of ice. The sea had seemed free enough at first. In December of 1914, the Endurance had pressed through lanes of dark, glassy water, weaving among towering bergs that glowed blue and green beneath the summer sun. The crew marveled at the shapes, cathedrals of ice, sharp spires, and walls that rose like ancient castles. Seals basked upon floes, penguins squawked in noisy groups, and seabirds wheeled in the sky above. But as the weeks passed, the lanes of water narrowed. Floes gathered more thickly. At times, the ship slowed almost to a stop, then pressed forward again as her engine churned and her sails filled with wind. The men leaned over the rails, watching the floes crack apart under the ship's bow, only to close again behind her. It was as if the sea were alive, reluctant to let them pass. By January, the Endurance was no longer moving freely. Ice gripped her hull, firm at first, then unrelenting. Shackleton ordered full power, but the ship only shuddered, straining like a creature caught in a trap. Day by day, the floes pressed closer, ridges rising around the vessel as frozen slabs ground against one another. At last, the ship stopped altogether. She was imprisoned in a frozen sea hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The men gathered on deck, staring out at the endless whiteness. There was no horizon, only a flat plain of ice stretching to meet a sky pale as milk. The wind blew without rest, scattering snow crystals that bit at their faces. Some men laughed, trying to treat the moment as an inconvenience, a mere pause in their voyage. Others stood in silence, realizing that the continent they had hoped to cross lay still far beyond their reach. Shackleton's voice cut through the wind. "Gentlemen, we are beset." He did not shout, nor did he waver. His tone was steady, almost calm, but his words carried the weight of truth. The dream of racing across Antarctica would have to wait. Their first duty was no longer glory, it was survival. Yet Shackleton knew something else as well. Despair could be more dangerous than the cold. And so he shaped the moment not as a defeat, but as a challenge. The Endurance, he told them, would now serve as their winter station. They would live upon her as though they had planned it all along. They would continue their work, caring for the dogs, recording scientific data, keeping order and routine. And above all, they would endure. The men took strength from his certainty. Though they knew little of what the months ahead would bring, they trusted Shackleton as they trusted the ship's timbers. Around them stretched a land that could kill them with frost, hunger, or shifting ice. But within their leader's calm voice lay a promise. They would face it together, and so the story began. Not as a march across a continent, but as a battle of spirit against the vast and merciless silence of Antarctica. The white hell had closed its jaws around them, but within those jaws, a tale of extraordinary endurance was waiting to be written. Part 2. A young officer named Shackleton, and long before the Endurance became trapped in the Antarctic pack ice, Ernest Shackleton was a restless young officer dreaming of the southern world. He had been born in 1874 in a quiet corner of Ireland, the second of 10 children. His father, a doctor, hoped Ernest might follow in his profession. But the boy's imagination was tied not to books of medicine but to the SAS. Soon as he was old enough, he left school behind and joined the merchant navy. There, on the wide oceans of the world, he learned the ways of ships and storms, of navigation and discipline. Yet more than the work, Shackleton loved the sense of possibility. Beyond every horizon, something new waited to be discovered. He had a thirst not just for travel, but for adventure. By the turn of the century, word was spreading of a place so vast and unknown it seemed like a dream. Antarctica. Very few had set foot there. The maps were blank, marked only by the guesses of cartographers. The last continent was, to young men of ambition, both a mystery and an invitation. It was in 1901 that Shackleton found his way into one of the great expeditions of that age, the British National Antarctic Expedition, led by a naval officer named Robert Falcon Scott. Their ship was the Discovery, and its mission was simple but monumental: to reach further south than anyone had gone before, and to conduct scientific study in a land that had barely been touched by human eyes. Shackleton, then in his late 20s, was chosen as third officer. His tasks were practical: managing stores, overseeing sled dogs, keeping order among the crew. but what mattered most was that he had a place on the journey. To him, it felt like stepping onto a stage where history itself would be written. The Discovery sailed south in 1901, through seas churned by icebergs and across waters where the compass quivered with uncertainty. Shackleton kept a sharp eye, noting everything: the discipline of the officers, the moods of the crew, the methods of handling dogs and sledges. He was young, but already his fellow sailors noticed his energy. He was quick with laughter, generous with encouragement, and eager to take on work. Men warmed to him, even when they bristled under stricter officers. That first Antarctic winter was a hard teacher. The sun vanished for months, leaving only cold darkness and the haunting sound of wind over the ice. Temperatures dropped so low that breath froze on beards in seconds. Shackleton threw himself into keeping morale alive. He joined in games on the ice, shared stories, and made certain no man felt forgotten. Though only a junior officer, he displayed a gift that would define his life: the ability to see not just the duties of leadership, but the hearts of the men around him. In the spring, the real test came. Scott, along with Shackleton and a young doctor named Edward Wilson, set out to march southward over the Great Ice Barrier, pushing toward the pole. It was a journey of staggering difficulty. They hauled sledges over ridges of snow and across fields of ice so hard it tore the skin from their hands. The sun blazed by day, blinding their eyes. The temperatures plunged at night, freezing their breath in the air. Their food was meager, their strength waning. Yet Shackleton pressed forward with stubborn courage. He was not one to complain, even when his body began to fail him. The three men trudged farther south than anyone had gone before, over 500 miles from their base, into a world no human had yet entered. At last, however, the effort became too much. Shackleton grew weak, coughing blood, his breath ragged with scurvy and exhaustion. Scott made the hard decision. Shackleton must return. It was a bitter moment. Shackleton, who had dreamed of triumph, found himself carried back half-conscious on the sledge he had once pulled. The others returned to the Discovery alive, but Shackleton's health was broken. He was sent home early, convalescent and humiliated. For some men, such an end might have meant the close of ambition. Shackleton, however, carried the wound not as defeat but as fuel. He had glimpsed the vast white world, had felt its pull deep in his bones. Far from breaking him, the experience sharpened his hunger. He told himself he would return, and not as a junior officer this time, but as a leader in his own right. Those who knew him afterward noticed a change. Shackleton was no longer just the eager young sailor. He was a man with purpose. He read, planned, and spoke often of Antarctica. To friends, he admitted he felt restless in England, as though he had left part of himself on the ice. His failure under Scott had not diminished him. Instead, it carved into him the resolve to one day command his own destiny. It was during this time that Shackleton began to develop his philosophy of leadership. He had seen Scott's discipline, strict and formal, which inspired respect but sometimes bred resentment. Shackleton sensed that men needed more than orders. They needed hope, laughter, and the belief that their leader truly cared for them. He had seen how loneliness could break a man more quickly than cold, and how small acts of kindness could give strength equal to food. By the time he was 30, Shackleton carried within him both the scars of failure and the spark of vision. He knew the Antarctic would call him back, and that when it did, he must be ready, not merely as an explorer chasing glory, but as a captain of men who would entrust him with their very lives. And so, even as he lived for a time in England, working at ordinary posts to support his family, his thoughts drifted always southward. Maps of Antarctica lined his desk. He kept in touch with other explorers, read reports, and imagined routes across the continent. For him, the frozen land was no longer just a curiosity. It was a destiny. The young officer who had fallen ill and been carried home from Scott's expedition was slowly shaping into something greater. He was becoming the man who would return to the ice, and in the end, write one of the greatest tales of survival ever told. Part 3. Chasing the South Pole. In the years after his return from Scott's discovery expedition, Shackleton carried with him both the sting of failure and the promise of unfinished business. He had been sent home sick and disappointed, but deep in his heart, he knew he was not done with the South. The frozen continent had left its mark upon him, like a dream that would not fade. By 1907, Shackleton had gathered enough support, funds, and courage to attempt something that few had ever dared, to reach the South Pole itself. At that time, the pole was more than a geographical point. It was a prize of immense prestige, a symbol of courage and determination in the age of exploration. Nations dreamed of planting their flags there, and the man who succeeded would join the ranks of history's greatest adventurers. Shackleton called his endeavor the British Antarctic Expedition, but the world would know it by the name of its ship, Nimrod. The vessel was smaller and less suited to icy seas than the Great Discovery had been, but Shackleton was undeterred. He gathered a crew of 15, men of varied skills, scientists, sailors, doctors, and craftsmen, united by curiosity and bravery. Some came for science, others for the thrill of adventure, but all placed their trust in Shackleton's leadership. When the Nimrod sailed south in the summer of 1907, she was crowded and uncomfortable. Supplies filled every corner. The men squeezed into narrow bunks. Shackleton himself gave up his cabin to house equipment, sleeping instead wherever space allowed. Already, the crew saw that he placed the mission and the welfare of others above his own comfort. It was a small gesture, but one that revealed the nature of his command. After weeks of stormy seas, the Nimrod pressed into the waters off Antarctica. Shackleton chose a base on the edge of the Great Ice Barrier, where the endless shelf of snow and ice stretched away to the south. There, in the bitter cold, the men built a hut to serve as their winter quarters. Its walls of wood, insulated with felt and seaweed, held out most of the wind, though the air inside often froze in glittering crystals. They called it simply the hut, but to them it was a fortress against the surrounding void. The winter was long, dark, and filled with the monotony of waiting. Shackleton knew how easily boredom could erode morale, so he encouraged games, readings, and even concerts. The men staged plays, recited poetry, and played cards by the light of flickering lamps. In the coldest nights, Shackleton moved quietly among them, making sure each man felt part of the whole. It was not just discipline that kept them together, but a sense of camaraderie and purpose. At last, in the spring of 1908, Shackleton launched his attempt on the pole. With 3 companions, Jameson Adams, Frank Wild, and Eric Marshall, he set off across the great white expanse. Their sledges were heavy with supplies, pulled not only by dogs but often by the men themselves, straining in harness against the endless miles of snow. The sun burned during the day, reflecting off the ice so fiercely it blinded their eyes. At night, the temperature dropped to unbearable lows, freezing their breath to their clothing. The march southward was grueling. Each mile seemed to fight them, each ridge and crevasse threatening to halt their progress. Food was scarce. Hunger gnawed constantly. Yet Shackleton pushed forward, driven by a mixture of ambition and duty. For weeks they trudged across the plateau, enduring storms that buried their tracks and winds that bit through their furs. Still, they pressed on until the needle of the compass pointed further south than it ever had before. At last, on January 9, 1909, Shackleton and his 3 men stood at a point just 97 nautical miles from the South Pole, the closest any human beings had ever come. They planted the Union Jack in the snow, a symbol of how far they had journeyed. Yet the pole itself remained beyond their grasp. Shackleton made the most difficult decision of his life, to turn back. He could see it in the faces of his men. They were exhausted, their strength nearly gone. The food left in their sledges would not last if they pressed further. If they forced themselves onward, they might reach the pole, but they would almost certainly never return. Shackleton's dream was before him, shining in the distance, but the lives of his men weighed heavier. He chose life over glory. "We must go back," he said quietly. There was no triumph in his voice, but there was no despair either. His companions understood. In that moment, Shackleton showed what kind of leader he was, not one who sacrificed men for fame, but one who placed their survival above all else. The return journey was brutal. The men stumbled, half-starved, across the ice. Shackleton himself grew weaker, but he refused to let despair take hold. He encouraged the others, shared his rations, and lifted spirits with quiet words. At last, against all odds, they reached the safety of their hut and, eventually, the Nimrod that would carry them home. Though he had not claimed the pole, Shackleton was celebrated in England. He was knighted for his courage, and his near success captured the imagination of the public. Yet in his own heart, he carried a mix of pride and unfinished longing. He had come closer than any man before him, but not close enough. Soon after, the pole itself would fall. In 1911, the Norwegian Roald Amundsen reached it first, planting his flag in triumph. Only weeks later, Robert Falcon Scott followed, arriving too late and perishing with his companions on the return journey. The age of racing for the pole was over. Shackleton's chance at that particular glory had passed. But for Shackleton, the story was not ended. The frozen continent still called to him, and though the pole had been claimed, another dream took root in his mind: to cross Antarctica from one side to the other, a feat no one had yet dared. It would be a journey not of planting flags but of endurance, a test of human spirit across the most merciless land on earth. The young officer who had once been carried home in weakness had grown into a leader who chose the lives of his men over his own ambition. And now, as he turned his eyes once more to the south, he began to imagine an expedition that would surpass them all. Part 4. A New Dream. Crossing Antarctica. When Shackleton returned from the Nimrod expedition, he carried with him both admiration and an aching sense of something unfinished. He had been knighted, celebrated in the papers, and honored by his peers. Yet he also knew that the South Pole, the very symbol of ultimate exploration, had already been claimed, first by Amundsen, then by Scott, whose tragic death had burned his name forever into history. The age of the race to the pole was over. But Shackleton was not a man to rest on past glories. The icy continent still whispered to him, promising new frontiers beyond flags and firsts. If he could not be the first to stand at the pole, then perhaps he could achieve something grander, something no one had even attempted: the crossing of the Antarctic continent from sea to sea. The idea seemed impossible. Antarctica was nearly 1,800 miles wide, a wilderness of glaciers, mountains, and frozen plains. No map showed a safe route, and no one knew if the journey could even be done. Yet in Shackleton's mind, the dream grew clearer with each passing day. It would be a test not of speed, but of endurance. And for Shackleton, endurance was the truest measure of courage. He began to speak of his vision. The crossing of the great white continent will be the last great journey left to man, he declared. His words carried the same mix of daring and calm certainty that had always drawn others to him. Slowly, support began to gather. Wealthy patrons offered funds, the Royal Geographical Society gave cautious approval, and the public grew excited at the prospect of another heroic venture to the far south. Shackleton worked tirelessly to prepare. He needed a ship strong enough to resist the crushing power of the pack ice, men skilled enough to survive in the most unforgiving environment, and supplies that would last for months upon months in the frozen desert. Above all, he needed faith, faith in his own ability to lead, and faith that his companions would share his vision. He placed an advertisement, though whether it ever truly appeared in print or lived only in memory remains uncertain. Legend has it that the notice read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness. Constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." Whether or not those exact words were published, they perfectly captured the spirit of the endeavor. And in answer, men came, hundreds of them. Sailors, soldiers, scientists, carpenters, and dreamers all offered themselves for the voyage. Many wrote letters filled with longing, speaking of duty, adventure, or simply the desire to follow Shackleton. From this sea of volunteers, Shackleton chose carefully. He valued skill, of course, but also something more elusive, resilience of spirit. A cheerful nature, a quick wit, or a quiet strength often weighed as heavily as any technical expertise. Shackleton knew that in the long months of ice and darkness, it was not just muscles but morale that kept men alive. Among those he chose were names that would become bound to his story. Frank Worsley, the bold and resourceful New Zealander who would command the ship; Tom Crean, the loyal Irishman who had already proven himself on Scott's ill-fated expedition; Frank Wild, Shackleton's trusted companion from the Nimrod days, whose steadiness anchored others in storms of despair. One by one, the ranks of the expedition filled with men who believed not only in the dream but in the man who dreamed it. For the ship, Shackleton secured a vessel built in Norway, designed for hunting polar seas. She was sturdy, with a rounded hull meant to rise above the ice rather than be crushed by it. Shackleton christened her with a name that carried the very essence of his vision. Endurance. As preparations continued, the shadow of war crept across Europe. In the summer of 1914, as Endurance made ready to sail, the world stumbled into the great conflict that would come to be known as the First World War. Shackleton, always mindful of duty, immediately offered his ship and crew to the Admiralty, ready to set aside his dream for the sake of his country. Yet the answer came back. The nation wished him to proceed. Perhaps the Admiralty sensed that Shackleton's expedition, far from the trenches and guns, would serve another kind of purpose, an inspiration, a reminder of human courage and endurance at a time when both would be sorely needed. And so, with a mixture of relief and gravity, Shackleton pressed forward. The Endurance was stocked with food, coal, sledges, scientific instruments, and the many small comforts that Shackleton insisted upon to sustain morale. There were games, books, musical instruments, even a ship's cat named Mrs. Chippy, whose quiet presence would bring warmth to the men's hearts. On a clear August day, the Endurance slipped her moorings and sailed from London. Crowds gathered on the docks to cheer them, their voices echoing across the Thames. Shackleton stood on deck, gazing ahead with a steady look. Behind him lay the world of comfort and safety. Before him stretched ice, storm, and uncertainty. Yet his heart was calm. The men bustled about the decks, adjusting sails, securing lines, laughing in the brisk wind. To them it was the beginning of a great adventure, a chance to test themselves against the last frontier. None could know then how severe the test would be, nor how dearly Shackleton's promise of endurance would be measured. As the ship glided down the river, past the city and out toward the sea, Shackleton remained quiet for a time. Then, turning to Frank Wilde beside him, he said softly, "We are going to make a mark that will outlast us all." It was not spoken with arrogance, but with conviction. For Shackleton knew that what lay ahead was more than an expedition. It was a journey into the heart of human spirit, a voyage that would ask everything of them, and give back lessons that would echo long after the ice had released its grip. And so, with sails full and hearts steady, the Endurance carried her crew away from the world of men into the waiting silence of the South. Part 5 Two teams. 1 Joel. When Sir Ernest Shackleton first announced his grand plan for the Imperial Transantarctic expedition, he envisioned not just one ship, but two. The dream was bold and simple, a crossing of the Antarctic continent from sea to sea, through the South Pole. To succeed, however, Shackleton knew the attempt would require help from both sides of the frozen world. Thus, two teams were formed. One would journey aboard the ship Endurance, entering Antarctica from the Weddell Sea. Shackleton himself would lead this party. Their task was to make the crossing itself, setting out with sledges, dogs, and supplies, striking inland toward the pole and continuing on to the far side. The second team would depart aboard another vessel, the Aurora, bound for the Ross Sea. This support group, though less celebrated, would be no less vital. Their duty was to march southward from their base and lay a series of supply depots across the ice, leading all the way toward the pole. These depots would be lifelines for Shackleton's party, ensuring that when the men came staggering across the icy interior, exhausted and half-starved, food and fuel would be waiting. It was a plan of interlocking parts, each dependent upon the other. For Shackleton, the arrangement was elegant and complete. But for the men who would carry it out, it meant hardship in two theaters of the Antarctic, separated by thousands of miles of impassable ice. The Endurance crew was handpicked, Shackleton himself weighing each man's character as much as his skills. Strength, endurance, and technical ability mattered, but even more important was spirit. Shackleton wanted men who would remain cheerful in adversity, who could sing in the darkest moments, and who would not crumble when the ice pressed hard. Sailors, scientists, carpenters, and cooks all joined the ranks, each contributing something unique to the venture. On the far side of the world, the Ross Sea Party assembled under less direct oversight from Shackleton. Their leader was Aeneas Mackintosh, a man who had already known the ice, having served with Shackleton on an earlier expedition. Beside him were men of varied background, some seasoned explorers, others new to such extremes, yet all committed to the cause. Their job, though lacking the glory of the crossing, was perhaps even more grueling. Hauling supplies across the most desolate plains on Earth, knowing the men they labored for might never even arrive. The two groups never met face to face. While Shackleton and his comrades prepared the Endurance in London and later in South America, the Ross Sea Party made their way to the southern oceans in their own vessel. Still, the bond between them was unspoken and strong. Each knew he was part of a greater whole, threads of one tapestry, bound by Shackleton's vision. By the summer of 1914, as Europe slid into the chaos of war, both halves of the expedition made ready to sail. Shackleton received offers from some of his men to enlist in the army instead, to fight for king and country. Yet Shackleton held them to their pledges, believing their service to exploration was also a service to humanity, a push at the boundaries of the unknown. In quiet moments, Shackleton thought often of the Ross Sea Party. He knew their burden would be heavy. while he and his men would strike inland with purpose, hearts fired by the prospect of a great crossing. The depot layers of the Ross Sea would toil without reward, laying store after store with no certainty their work would ever be used. Their toil was an act of faith, and Shackleton valued it deeply. The logistics were vast and intricate. Ships were provisioned with food, dogs, sledges, fuel, and scientific instruments. Clothing was fashioned from wool and fur, designed to ward off the unrelenting cold. Tents were sewn, sledges reinforced, boots lined with reindeer hair. Every item carried its weight in survival. For the men, preparations meant more than equipment. It meant the shaping of the mind and heart to face months of darkness, hunger, and isolation. Shackleton spoke often of unity, reminding his party that only by standing together, by sharing each hardship equally, could they hope to prevail. As the weeks passed, both teams grew restless with anticipation. In far-off harbors, they heard the distant rumble of war across Europe, yet their thoughts were fixed on the ice. Shackleton's endurance was destined for the Weddell Sea, where pack ice would be their first great test. The Ross Sea party aboard the Aurora would establish themselves on the opposite shore, braving the frozen Ross ice shelf. Two ships, two groups of men, two halves of a single daring dream. The world might soon forget their departure, lost in the noise of armies marching and guns firing across Europe. But Shackleton knew, and the men knew, that their story would be written not in headlines, but in the white silence of the Antarctic. Theirs was not a march of conquest, but of endurance. Not a clash of armies, but of men against nature's most unforgiving face. Together, though oceans and continents lay between them, they were bound to one purpose. And so, as 1914 faded into 1915, the twin threads of the expedition began to unravel across the globe. The Endurance would strike into the Weddell Sea. The Aurora would seek the Ross Sea. Both would carry with them hope, courage, and Shackleton's unyielding belief that no man must be left behind. The stage was set. The men were ready. Ahead lay ice, toil, and trials beyond imagining. Two teams. One goal. Part 6. War and Departure. The year was 1914, and across Europe a storm was gathering. In quiet drawing rooms and bustling cafes, newspapers whispered of armies on the move, of nations bracing for war. Shackleton's great expedition, planned with such energy, promised with such boldness, suddenly found itself overshadowed by events that threatened to change the world. In London, Shackleton waited for the news with growing unease. The Endurance was provisioned and ready. The men were chosen, the dogs secured, and the dream of crossing Antarctica lay almost within reach. But in the first days of August, the certainty of war burst forth. Britain declared its support for Belgium, and the Empire was at war with Germany. The expedition's departure suddenly seemed small in comparison. Shackleton, ever conscious of duty, did not hesitate. He offered both his ships, his men, and all supplies to the Admiralty to be used for the defense of the nation. The reply, when it came, was short and striking. It read, "Proceed." The message, so brief yet so powerful, filled Shackleton with both relief and resolve. The government had recognized the worth of his expedition, not as a distraction, but as a contribution. While others would fight in the fields of Europe, he and his men would fight the battle against the ice. A different kind of war, but one that carried its own weight of courage and endurance. The men of the Endurance received the news with mixed feelings. Some had considered volunteering for the army instead, eager to serve in the conflict. But Shackleton reminded them that their service here was no less valuable. "There are many who can fight," he said, "but few who can do this." And so, with the blessing of their country, they pressed ahead. The departure was not grand. In fact, it seemed almost modest, hidden beneath the shadow of war. On the morning of August 8, 1914, the Endurance slipped quietly out of the docks at Plymouth. Families and well-wishers waved from the shore, their hearts torn between pride and worry. The men, standing at the rails, lifted their caps and called their farewells. None could know how long the journey ahead would stretch, or whether they would return at all. The sea, as always, had its own greetings. Waves rose and fell beneath the bow, gulls circled overhead, and the wind carried them outward into the channel. England receded into mist, and with it, the last touch of familiar ground. From Plymouth they sailed south, stopping at Madeira and then Buenos Aires. At each port, supplies were taken aboard, letters were written home, and the crew stretched their legs before facing the endless ocean again. Shackleton watched his men closely, noting their cheerfulness, their energy, their willingness to work hard without complaint. These were the qualities that mattered most, for he knew that the ice would test their spirits more than their bodies. In South America, they were received with curiosity and warmth. The newspapers, despite the war, found space to report on the daring Englishmen bound for the Antarctic. In Buenos Aires, local supporters hosted gatherings, offering gifts and goodwill. Shackleton, ever aware of his responsibilities, spoke simply of the journey, its risks, its hopes, its promise of discovery. But beneath his calm voice, he carried a burden heavier than most could guess. He had led men into the polar regions before, and he knew the dangers. Now, with a world at war behind him, the weight of expectation was doubled. Failure was unthinkable, yet he also knew that nature offered no guarantees. At last, the Endurance reached the southern port of Grytviken, on the island of South Georgia. Nestled amid steep mountains and icy bays, it was a whaling station, the last outpost of human presence before the vast emptiness of the Antarctic. The whalers, hardened men who knew the southern seas, welcomed Shackleton and his crew. Over shared meals and conversations, they spoke of the ice. Their warnings were grave. The Weddell Sea, they said, was treacherous, its pack ice dense and restless, often impossible to penetrate. More than one ship had been lost there, crushed like a toy beneath the shifting flows. Shackleton listened, nodded, and considered their words. Yet in his heart the decision was already made. The expedition could not turn back. His duty was clear: to sail south, to reach the ice, and to attempt the crossing. He thanked the whalers for their advice, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia and turned her bow toward the unknown. The mountains of the island dwindled behind them, and ahead stretched only gray water, heavy skies, and the promise of ice. The men stood on deck, gazing at the sea with excitement. Some laughed, some fell silent, each lost in his own thoughts. They knew that they were leaving behind the last touch of civilization. Beyond lay only the white wilderness, where no help could reach them and no word could be sent back. Shackleton, standing at the rail, let the cold wind whip across his face. The journey had truly begun. Behind him lay a world at war. Before him lay the mightiest battlefield of all, the Antarctic itself. And so, with steady hearts and quiet courage, the Endurance and her men sailed southward, into a story that would test the very limits of human spirit. Part 7. Into the pack ice. The Endurance sailed south from South Georgia into waters that grew colder with every passing day. The air was sharper now, filled with the crisp edge of the Antarctic summer. gulls that had followed the ship for weeks began to vanish, replaced by the occasional albatross gliding on great, silent wings. The men, standing at the rail, peered ahead with eager eyes, waiting for the first glimpse of what they had come so far to see. The icebergs did not keep them waiting long. Before many days had passed, small fragments appeared on the water. First just slivers, like broken glass drifting on the swell. Then came larger pieces, white plates rocking gently, some no bigger than a man's hand, others broad enough to carry a seal. The sailors pointed them out to one another, joking and marveling, for each fragment was a herald of the world to come. Soon the sea itself was dotted with floes, spreading wide until the horizon gleamed with brightness. The men felt a strange mixture of excitement and caution. The Antarctic was drawing near. On December 14, 1914, they sighted the first Great Barrier of pack ice. It stretched in a ragged line across the sea, an endless field of frozen slabs locked together, drifting and pressing with the slow power of wind and current. Here was the boundary to their world, the living wall that guarded the entrance to the Weddell Sea. Shackleton gave the order to press on. The engines throbbed, and the Endurance pushed into the ice. The men lined the rails, watching as the bow struck floes and forced them aside. Sometimes the floes yielded easily, parting with a soft crunch. At other times, they resisted, grinding against the ship's hull, as if reluctant to let her pass. The timbers shivered, but the Endurance was strong. She had been built for this very trial, her hull reinforced and her ribs stout. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, took special pride in her performance. "She's a fine vessel," he muttered, running his hand along the rail. "She'll stand more than most." The men nodded. The Endurance inspired confidence, and they trusted her as they trusted Shackleton himself. As the ship pushed deeper into the pack, the scenery grew ever more wondrous. Floes stretched like endless meadows of white, broken by lanes of dark water that twisted and curved. Some floes rose in hummocks, piled high where slabs had crushed together. Icebergs loomed, vast and silent, their blue shadows gleaming in the sun. Seals lay sprawled on the ice, lifting their heads lazily to watch the strange intruders. Penguins waddled in little groups, their calls sharp and cheerful, as if mocking the ship's slow progress. The men leaned on the rails, laughing at the penguins' antics and calling greetings across the water. Even the dogs barked with excitement, tugging at their chains and yelping as if eager to join the chase. Everywhere was light and color, sunlight glinting off ice, the sky a brilliant dome of blue, and the sea a deep, shifting green. It was a world both beautiful and forbidding, a place of wonder where every horizon promised both marvels and danger. Shackleton watched it all with steady eyes. He felt the thrill of discovery, but also the weight of responsibility. The pack ice was no playground. It was alive, moving with tides and winds, unpredictable as the sea itself. He knew that once the Endurance was deep inside, escape would not be easy. But if they were to reach the continent, they had no choice but to press on. The men, for their part, carried on with cheerfulness. Work was steady, spirits high. When the ship slowed against a heavy floe, they took to the ice with picks and poles, hacking channels to free her. Laughter echoed across the frozen plain as they swung their tools, slipping and stumbling, their breath steaming in the cold at night. When the ship lay still among the floes, they gathered in the mess, warmed by the stove, telling stories and singing songs. Outside, the sun never truly set, casting the ice in soft colors of gold and rose. It was the Antarctic summer, a season of long light, and the men reveled in its strange beauty, Day by day, the Endurance pressed deeper. The ice thickened, the leads narrowed, and progress slowed. The engines strained, and the helmsman steered carefully, seeking paths through the maze. Sometimes the ship was forced to stop, waiting for a shift in the flows. The men used those pauses to stretch their legs on the ice, playing football, racing the dogs, or simply wandering in wonder across the frozen plain. Yet even in those moments of play, there was awareness beneath the laughter. The ice could close at any time, seizing the ship in its grip. The groan of pressure, the crack of floes colliding, were constant reminders that they were trespassers in a world ruled by forces far greater than themselves. As Christmas approached, the men decorated the mess with bits of bunting and paper, singing carols and exchanging small gifts. Shackleton made sure there was plum pudding and an extra ration of cocoa. For that night, at least, the frozen sea outside seemed less threatening. The men toasted one another, their voices rising with warmth and hope. But beyond the glow of their laughter, the pack ice stretched on, vast, restless, and unyielding. It had already tested them, and soon it would test them far more. For now, though the Endurance sailed bravely on, her masts tall against the white horizon, her crew steady and determined. Into the pack ice they had come, and into the pack ice they would venture deeper still, seeking the coast of Antarctica and the beginning of their great crossing. The men did not know it yet, but the ice that surrounded them was not merely a barrier. It would become their world, their prison, and their greatest trial. Part 8. The frozen prison. Through December and into the new year, the Endurance continued her slow progress through the Weddell Sea. Each day brought fresh challenges, lanes of open water that closed without warning, towering ridges of ice that forced detours, and sudden shifts in the flows that set the ship trembling. The men worked with pick and shovel, hacking paths and clearing channels, but the pack ice always seemed to move faster than they could see. By mid-January 1915, the ice was tightening. Shackleton stood often at the bridge, scanning the horizon. The ship, once free to nose between floes, was now hemmed in by walls of white. The leads narrowed, then vanished altogether. The Endurance slowed, stopped, and finally came to rest in a solid grip of ice. At first, Shackleton hoped it would be temporary. The summer sun was still strong, and with a change in wind or current, the floes might drift apart again. But as days stretched into weeks, the ship did not move. She was caught as surely as if shackled by chains. The men gave her prison a name: the Frozen Sea. Life aboard changed quickly. With the engines silent and the sails furled, the Endurance became less a ship and more a winter station. Shackleton ordered the dogs exercised on the ice, their barking and yelping ringing out in the still air. Men took long walks across the floes, learning the strange, shifting landscape that now surrounded them. They hunted seals and penguins, adding fresh meat to their stores. Inside, the ship grew warm and lively. The mess room echoed with laughter, songs, and the scrape of fiddle bows across strings. Chessboards and card games passed the hours, while the cook, Charles Green, worked small miracles with limited supplies. Even in confinement, Shackleton insisted on routine. Meals at regular times, duties assigned, spirits lifted by humor and companionship. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, crafted small improvements to make life more bearable. Dog kennels, stronger sledges, even makeshift furniture. The scientists recorded observations, collecting specimens when the ice allowed. Each man had a role, and Shackleton made sure none felt idle. For though they were trapped, they were not beaten. The days lengthened into the height of the Antarctic summer. Sunlight glowed around the clock, shimmering across the floes in dazzling colors: gold, pink, and pale blue. The men marveled at the beauty, though it was beauty edged with menace. For even as the ice shone like crystal, it creaked and groaned beneath unseen pressures. Great ridges rose suddenly, blocks of ice tilting upward like the walls of some hidden fortress. The ship felt those pressures most keenly. From below came shudders, from within came groans, as if the Endurance herself protested her confinement. Shackleton, listening in the quiet hours, knew the danger was growing. A ship could endure much, but no vessel was stronger than the ice that gripped her by early autumn. All hope of release was gone. The sea froze fast around them, and the ship became part of the floe itself. She drifted now not under her own power, but under the whim of the currents. Shackleton realized that their fate was no longer to cross the continent, but simply to survive. He broke the news gently to his men. They would remain with the ship through the coming winter. They must endure the darkness, the cold, and the uncertainty of drifting ice. The grand dream of a transantarctic march was over. The men listened in silence. They had dreamed of glory, of discovery, of marching across the very heart of the white continent. Now that dream was replaced with another: to live. Yet Shackleton, with his calm voice and steady gaze, made the prospect less grim. He reminded them that they still had food, shelter, and companionship. The ship was strong, the dogs were healthy, and the men were in good spirits. Together, they could face what lay ahead as the Antarctic winter approached. The world around them grew stranger still. The sun dipped lower each day, until at last it sank and did not rise again. Darkness fell across the floes, broken only by the flicker of auroras dancing overhead. Curtains of green, violet, and white shimmered across the sky, their silent glow a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond. And that darkness, the ship became their fortress, her lamps glowing warmly against the endless night. Inside, they sang, played games, and told stories. Shackleton encouraged laughter, knowing it was the best shield against despair. Yet outside, the ice pressed harder. The Endurance groaned and shivered, her timbers bending under the strain. At times, the men rushed to the deck, fearing she might be crushed outright. But each time, the pressure eased, and she held so the months passed. Men and dogs confined in their frozen prison, drifting slowly with the pack. No man could say where the ice would carry them, or what trials still lay ahead. In his diary, Shackleton wrote quietly of the change in their mission. The situation is not cheerful, but the men are in good spirits. A ship frozen fast is a hard thing, but a spirit frozen fast is worse. That we shall not allow. His words became truth, for though they were prisoners of the ice, they refused to let despair take hold. Each day was lived with purpose, each night filled with companionship. The Antarctic had trapped their ship, but it had not trapped their spirit, and so the Endurance and her crew passed into the long winter, locked in their frozen prison, waiting, watching, and enduring. What none of them yet knew was that this prison would soon tighten its grip, and the ship they trusted so dearly would not withstand forever the power of the ice. Part 9. The ice closes in the winter of 1915 dragged on with a patience that tested even the strongest spirit. The Endurance lay imprisoned in the pack, her masts rising tall above the floes, her hull groaning under constant strain. Around her, the white wilderness stretched without end. A frozen desert, shifting and restless, alive with hidden power. At first, the ship endured bravely. She had been built for this work, her timbers stout and reinforced, her sides curved to deflect the squeeze of the floes. For months, she resisted the slow crush, lifting gently when pressure mounted, settling back again when the ice relented. The men took comfort in her strength. They spoke of her as if she were a living thing, a trusted companion standing firm beside them. But the Antarctic does not yield. It waits, presses, and in time, it conquers. By August, the groaning of the ice grew louder. Sometimes the men would wake in the night to the deep, resonant crack of floes colliding, like cannons echoing across the frozen sea. Great ridges rose suddenly, slabs of ice thrust upward into towers taller than a man. The ship shuddered with every movement, as though gripped in a giant's fist. The crew learned to listen. They could tell from the sound whether the ice was merely shifting or whether it was pressing hard against the ship. When the booming grew sharper, they hurried to the deck, lanterns swinging in the darkness, eyes scanning the floes. They never knew when the next squeeze might come, or how much more the Endurance could withstand. Shackleton, calm and steady, was always first among them. He studied the pressure ridges, watched the ship's timbers flex, and gave quiet orders. To the men, his composure was a shield. If the boss was calm, then perhaps all was well. Yet inside, Shackleton knew the truth. The ship could not withstand forever. In September, the pressure grew worse. The floes shifted violently, heaving and grinding. The Endurance was caught in the jaws of two great slabs, her sides pressed with terrifying force. The timbers creaked, nails shrieked, and seams gaped. Water seeped in, freezing as it rose. The carpenter, Harry McNish, inspected the damage, shaking his head grimly. "She's a gallant ship," he murmured. "But no wood can stand against this forever." Shackleton heard, but did not contradict him. The men worked tirelessly to relieve the strain. They hacked at the ice around the hull, using picks and shovels to create space, sweating despite the bitter cold. They set up pumps, bailing out the water that seeped below. It was desperate work, but it gave them purpose, and for a time it kept the ship afloat. Still, the pressure never ceased. Each day brought new groans, new cracks, new wounds. The Endurance fought bravely, but the ice was relentless. By October, the ship's fate was sealed. The floes closed in with crushing power, splintering her beams, driving her stern upward and her bow downward. Her decks buckled, her masts leaned. She was no longer a proud vessel, but a broken creature caught in the grip of a merciless foe. On October 24th, the men gathered on the ice, watching as the ship bent and groaned. The sound was terrible, a chorus of cracking wood, like gunfire echoing in the frozen night. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others stood in silence, their faces pale in the lantern light. Shackleton gave the order no man wanted to hear. "Prepare to abandon ship." Calmly, methodically, the men lowered supplies onto the ice. Tents, sledges, tools, and food. They brought down the dogs, their excited barks piercing the stillness. Even Mrs. Chippy the cat was carried gently to safety. Around them, the ship that had been their home creaked and splintered, her lifeblood leaking into the frozen sea. For weeks they clung to hope, making trips back to salvage what they could. But on November 21st, 1915, the Endurance succumbed at last. With a final groan, her stern rose high, her bow sank beneath the ice, and she slipped slowly into the depths. The men watched in silence as the sea closed over her. There were no cheers, no cries, only the quiet grief of men who had lost a faithful companion. Shackleton broke the silence with simple words. "She's gone, boys. We must go on without her." And with that, the men turned from the wreck and faced the greater trial ahead. They were no longer explorers bound for glory, but castaways adrift upon the ice, 1,000 miles from help, with only what they could carry that night. As they lay in their tents upon the frozen floe, the men listened to the eerie silence where once the ship had groaned. Some wept softly, others stared into the darkness, but none gave voice to despair. Shackleton moved among them, offering quiet encouragement. His presence reminded them that though the Endurance was lost, their hope need not be. For now, the ice itself was their home. They named their camp Ocean Camp and began the long struggle for survival. The ship was gone. The dream of crossing the continent was gone. But the men were alive, and as long as they breathed, Shackleton would not let them lose heart. The ice had closed in, but the story was far from over. Part 10. The death of the Endurance. The days after Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship passed in a haze of disbelief. The men camped on the ice close to the vessel that had carried them so far, watching her as though she were still alive, a wounded creature struggling against her fate. The Endurance stood proud in spirit, though broken in body, her masts tilted, her decks warped, her timbers torn by the merciless grip of the pack. Each morning, the men ventured back across the ridges of ice to salvage what they could. Provisions, tools, clothing, instruments, all had to be carried out before the ship slipped beneath the floes. Shackleton insisted they save only what was essential. Personal treasures, however cherished, had to be left behind. He himself set the example, carrying only a few photographs and his Bible, from which he tore out a page to keep and laid the rest down upon the ice. "Travel light, boys," he reminded them gently. "It is our lives we must preserve now." The men obeyed, though their hearts ached at what they left behind. Journals were reduced to scraps, mementos abandoned, possessions surrendered to the ice. It was a painful sacrifice, but necessary. Every pound carried might mean the difference between survival and defeat. Through October and into November, the pressure mounted. Day and night, the ship groaned and shuddered as the floes squeezed tighter. The sound carried eerily across the camp. Cracks like rifle fire, splintering wood like cannon shots. The men listened in silence, knowing each crack was a death knell for their ship. The carpenter, McNish, studied the twisting hull with a professional's eye. "She's making her last stand," he muttered, sorrow thick in his voice. To him, the Endurance was more than timber and iron. She was a creation of skill and pride, a thing of beauty. Watching her die was like watching a friend slip away. By mid-November, water gushed through the wounds in her side. Pumps could no longer keep pace, and the ship sagged lower each day. Shackleton ordered her stores stripped bare, everything useful removed. Food, sledges, canvas, rope, and the lifeboats that had once been meant for short journeys but now held the men's only hope of escape. The men trudged back and forth, carrying their spoils to the camp on the ice. It was bitter work. Behind them, the Endurance sagged deeper into the pressure, her decks collapsing, her proud shape distorted beyond recognition. On November 21, 1915, the end came. The men gathered on the ice, drawn by a dreadful sound. A deep, resonant groan that rose into sharp cracks and echoes like gunfire. The Endurance shuddered as her back broke, her timbers splintering under the final squeeze. Her stern lifted high, her bow plunged low, and a rush of icy water surged into her open wounds. Frank Hurley, the photographer, set up his camera, his fingers stiff with cold, capturing her last moments in still images that would one day tell the tale. The others watched in silence, faces pale, breath misting in the frozen air. Some men stood with hats removed, as if at a funeral. Others clenched their jaws, fighting back tears. There was no need for speeches. The sound of the dying ship was its own solemn eulogy. Slowly, inexorably, the Endurance slipped beneath the surface. The sea closed over her broken hull, and the ice drifted back together, erasing the wound as though she had never been. Where once a proud ship had stood, there was now only a patch of open water, soon sealed by new ice. "She's gone, boys," Shackleton said at last, his voice steady but heavy. "We must go on without her." For a long while no one moved. The men stared at the blank space, unable to believe it. The Endurance had been more than wood and sail. She had been their home, their shield, their link to the world they had left behind. To lose her was to feel cut adrift, truly alone in the vast white wilderness. At last, Shackleton turned away. "Come," he said gently. "There is work to do." The men followed, their boots crunching on the snow, their figures small against the endless plain. Behind them, the sea whispered beneath the ice, carrying away the remains of the ship that had once promised them adventure and triumph. That night, as they huddled in their tents, the silence pressed in heavier than ever. The familiar creak of timbers, the comforting groan of the ship, was gone. Only the wind and the distant crackle of shifting floes remained. The men lay awake, each alone with his thoughts. Some mourned quietly, others stared upward at the canvas roof, imagining the stars beyond. Shackleton moved from tent to tent, offering words of encouragement. His task now was greater than ever, to keep hope alive when everything seemed lost. He reminded the men that though the ship was gone, their will to endure was not. They had food, they had shelter, they had each other, and they had a leader who would not rest until they were safe. The Endurance was gone, but her spirit lived on in the men she had carried. Her very name became their watchword, a quiet promise whispered in the cold. Endure. When morning came, the men rose and set about their work. They called their new home on the ice ocean camp. From here, they would plan their next move, waiting for the drifting floes to carry them closer to open water, where the lifeboats might one day take them to land. The dream of crossing Antarctica was gone. The dream of glory was gone. But the greater challenge lay before them. Survival against the odds, in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. And so the death of the Endurance marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of the greatest test these men would ever face. For now, they bowed their heads to the loss, then lifted their eyes to the horizon. Ahead stretched ice, uncertainty, and hardship. Yet behind them, in the deep, the spirit of the Endurance sailed on, a guardian in memory, urging them forward. Part 11. Drift on the Ephesus. After the Endurance sank beneath the ice, the men were left in a silence that felt deeper than the ocean itself. No longer sheltered by their ship, they were castaways upon the drifting floes, tiny figures in a boundless wilderness of white. Above them stretched the pale sky, sometimes a faint blue, more often the color of steel. Around them, the pack ice creaked and groaned, alive with slow, restless movement. They called their first settlement Ocean Camp. Tents of canvas, patched and reinforced, stood like little islands upon the ice. Supplies were stacked in careful piles. Boxes of food, coils of rope, sledges, and the precious lifeboats hauled from the ship. Around the perimeter, the dogs barked and played, their breath steaming in the frosty air. Shackleton walked among the camp each morning, making sure all was in order. He checked the tents, the rations, and most importantly, the faces of his men. He knew their spirits were as fragile as their supplies. A word of encouragement here, a quiet pat on the shoulder there. It was these small gestures that kept despair at bay. Life on the floes settled into rhythm, though never an easy one. Each day brought chores: gathering ice for water, tending the dogs, checking the stores. The men repaired clothing, mended harnesses, and built windbreaks from blocks of snow. They hunted for seals and penguins, whose meat kept their bodies strong and whose blubber fed the cooking stoves. Meals were simple but hearty. Steaming stews of seal meat, sometimes thickened with crushed biscuits, were ladled out into tin mugs. Hot drinks of tea or cocoa gave warmth and comfort. Around the galley stove, little more than a makeshift box of iron fueled with blubber, the men would sit close, talking and laughing. In that circle of warmth, the vast desolation outside seemed, for a moment, far away. Hurley, the photographer, kept spirits bright by showing the men his pictures, snapshots of dogs at play, or comrades grinning despite the cold. Worsley, the captain, studied the ice and sky, plotting the drift of their flow on his charts. Greenstreet, the second officer, baked makeshift bread in a pot, filling the camp with the welcome scent of fresh food. Each man had his part to play, and in playing it, they gave the group strength. The floes beneath them were never still. They shifted, groaned, and cracked without warning. Sometimes in the night, a loud report would split the silence, and the men would rush from their tents, lanterns in hand, to see if the ice beneath them was breaking apart. On one such night, a crack opened right through the middle of camp, scattering supplies and splitting a tent in two. Quick hands and calm leadership saved the day, but the men were reminded once more how fragile their refuge truly was. Shackleton never let them forget that they must always be ready. The lifeboats were kept near at hand, loaded with essentials, in case the flow broke up suddenly. Each man knew where he must go and what he must carry in such an emergency. It was a hard way to live, always prepared for disaster, but it was the only way to survive on the drifting ice. Despite the hardship, Shackleton insisted on moments of normality. He organized games on clear days. Football played upon the snow with makeshift goals, races with the dogs harnessed to sledges, even light-hearted singing contests in the evenings. Laughter rang across the ice, mingling with the cries of distant seabirds. It was Shackleton's gift. This ability to remind his men that they were not merely survivors, but still human beings, capable of joy even in the bleakest place on Earth. Weeks passed, and Ocean Camp drifted slowly with the moving pack. Worsley's careful observations showed that the current was carrying them northward, toward open water. It was a slow journey, measured not in miles but in inches. Each day, the horizon looked much the same, and the men's patience was tested by monotony. Still, hope stirred in their hearts. If the floes carried them far enough, they might one day launch the lifeboats and strike for land. Until then, they endured, as the ship's name had commanded them. By December, the weather grew warmer, though warm in Antarctica meant little more than snow softening underfoot and temperatures that bit a little less cruelly. With the thaw came change. The floes grew thinner, cracks widened, and pools of dark water spread across the ice. What had once been a solid prison was becoming a restless sea. Shackleton knew they could not stay long at Ocean Camp. The ice that carried them was also betraying them. Soon it would no longer bear their weight. On December 23rd, Shackleton gave the order to prepare for a move. The men packed the tents, loaded sledges, and hitched up the dogs. They dragged their lifeboats across the ridged and broken ice, a grueling labor that tested their strength to the limit. Some days they advanced only a few miles, others no more than a few hundred yards. The surface was rough, the sledges heavy, the men weary. Yet Shackleton walked at the head, setting the pace, his presence a steady beacon of resolve. After days of exhausting struggle, Shackleton made a decision. The effort was draining his men's strength, and the ice was drifting northward without their help. Better, he judged, to camp once more and let the current carry them. Thus was born Patience Camp, a name that spoke of the greatest tool they now required. Patience Camp. Life returned to the old rhythm, but with greater uncertainty. The flows grew smaller, the cracks more frequent, the water ever nearer. Seals and penguins became scarcer as the pack drifted farther north, making hunting difficult. Rations had to be stretched. Yet the men kept on, holding to their leader's calm example. They watched the horizon for signs of open sea. They listened each night to the groans and splashes of the breaking ice, wondering when the time would come to launch the boats. Through it all, Shackleton reminded them of the promise. "We will all get home. Not a man will be left behind." The men believed him, for belief was as vital as food or shelter. And so, on the drifting floes, in the shadow of uncertainty, they endured. The endurance was gone, but the men lived by her name. The ice carried them onward, slowly, inexorably, toward whatever trials awaited next. Part 12. The Open Boats. April of 1916. The drifting ice had carried Shackleton and his men farther north than any of them could have imagined when they first lost the Endurance. The frozen world that had once trapped them was breaking apart. Cracks spread wide across the floes, pools of dark water opened at their feet, and the very ground beneath their tents trembled with each shift to Patience Camp. The men could feel the sea rising beneath them. The floes that had seemed broad and steady now rocked uneasily, like rafts at anchor. Shackleton knew the time had come. They could no longer trust the ice. Their only hope was to take to the boats and seek land. On April 9th, Shackleton gave the order, "Prepare to launch the boats." The men obeyed without hesitation, though each felt the weight of the moment. Ahead lay one of the most dangerous journeys imaginable, a crossing of the open Southern Ocean in small, overloaded lifeboats. The sea was no friend, and the autumn storms of Antarctica were cruel beyond measure. But the ice no longer gave them shelter. They had no choice but to go. The 3 boats had been named after Shackleton's sponsors: the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Each was strengthened and patched by McNish, the carpenter, their seams sealed with what materials he could find. They were sturdy enough but small, only 20 feet long, open to wind and wave, without deck or cabin. Into these frail vessels the men loaded all they could carry: tents, sleeping bags, cooking gear, and the dwindling store of food. They lashed barrels of water to the thwarts, stowed sacks of biscuits and tins of meat beneath their feet, and tucked away the most precious cargo of all, their hope of survival. When everything was ready, the men pushed the boats into the cold green water. The floe that had been their home groaned as it cracked behind them, as if bidding farewell. Shackleton climbed into the James Caird, Worsley took command of the Dudley Docker, and Wild led the Stancomb Wills. With strong arms pulling at the oars, the little flotilla set out into the heaving sea. The ocean greeted them without mercy. Waves towered high, crashing against the boats and drenching the men in freezing spray. The wind howled, biting through their sodden clothing. Ice still drifted in great blocks, colliding with the boats, threatening to smash their fragile sides. The men bailed constantly, scooping water from the bottoms of the boats with tin mugs and helmets. Their hands were raw, their faces stung with salt and cold. Yet they rode on hour after hour, their eyes fixed on Shackleton's steady figure at the helm. Food was scarce, and meals were hurried affairs. Hardtack biscuits softened in seawater, scraps of seal meat, a spoonful of cold stew passed from hand to hand. Still, the men found moments to laugh, to share a joke, to sing a song against the roaring of the wind. In the darkest hours, humor was as vital as bread. For 7 days, they battled the sea. The boats rose and fell on towering swells, sometimes lost entirely in the troughs, then lifted skyward on crests that revealed only more endless waves. Sleep was scarce, for there was no room to lie down, and the cold gnawed at their bones. Many were frostbitten, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes red from spray and exhaustion. But still they endured. Shackleton's promise, that no man would be left behind, burned like a lantern in their hearts. Each stroke of the oar, each moment of endurance, was an act of faith in that VOW. Last, on April 15th, a cry rose from the James Caird. Land! Land ahead! Eyes strained through mist and spray, and there it was, a dark shape on the horizon, rising above the waves like a dream. It was Elephant Island, a barren, rocky outcrop on the very fringe of the Antarctic. No one had ever lived there, no ship passed nearby, but it was land. Solid, unmoving land. The men rowed with renewed strength, though the sea fought them fiercely. Exhausted, half-frozen, they battled surf and storm until, one by one, the boats ground against the stony shore. Men tumbled out, stumbling on weak legs, kissing the wet rocks as though they were holy ground. For the first time in 497 days, they stood on land. The relief was overwhelming. Some men wept openly, others laughed and shouted, their voices echoing off the cliffs. Shackleton himself allowed a rare smile, though his mind was already turning to the challenges ahead. Elephant Island was no safe haven. It was desolate, exposed, and far from any hope of rescue. But it was land, and on land they could rest, dry their clothes, and gather their strength. They dragged the boats above the high tide line, turned them into makeshift shelters, and lit fires with blubber to cook hot meals. The smoke rose into the gray sky, a fragile signal of life in that lonely corner of the world. For the first time in many months, the men slept without fear that the ice beneath them would give way. The earth was solid under their bodies, the waves a distant roar beyond their camp. They had survived the open boats, the wildest seas Shackleton himself had ever known. Yet even in their joy, they knew the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. No ship would ever pass Elephant Island by chance. If they stayed, they would surely perish. Someone would have to sail across the stormiest waters on Earth to bring rescue. That night, as the men huddled beneath their makeshift shelters, Shackleton lay awake, staring into the darkness. His promise still echoed in his heart. Not a man will be left behind. To keep it, he would have to lead one final, desperate voyage. But for now, as the surf pounded against the rocks and the wind swept over the island, the men slept deeply. They had endured the open sea, and their feet once more touched firm ground. It was enough for a night. The ocean had tried to claim them, but they still lived. And as long as they lived, there was hope. Part 14. The James Caird voyage. The James Caird, though strengthened by McNish's skilled hands, was still only a lifeboat, 22 feet long, built for short passages near a shore, never for an ocean crossing. Yet, on that gray morning of April 24, 1916, it became the vessel of hope for all 28 souls of the Endurance expedition. 6 men climbed aboard, their hearts steeled against fear, while 22 others stood silently on the stony beach of Elephant Island, waving them off into the vast unknown. The little boat pushed through the surf, rose on a swell, and then was lost from sight. For the watchers on the shore, it was as if their very lifeline had vanished into the sea. For Shackleton and his chosen crew, it was the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of human endurance and seamanship. Inside the James Caird, conditions were almost unbearable. The sides, though raised with planks, were low against the seas. Every wave threatened to swamp them, and icy water constantly sloshed across the deck. The makeshift canvas roof kept out some spray, but it leaked and sagged, and the men were always wet. Beneath them, rocks served as ballast, rolling and grinding under their feet. There was no space to stretch out. Each man was wedged into a narrow place, braced against the pitching of the boat. Their diet was sparse. Ship's biscuits, hush made from pemmican, and occasional sips of hot milk when they could light the Primus stove. Water was gathered from melted ice or rain. Everything tasted of salt and smoke, yet it kept them alive. The true miracle of the voyage lay in navigation. The Southern Ocean was a maelstrom of storms, with skies often clouded, leaving no glimpse of the sun or stars. Yet Worsley, the master navigator, seized every fleeting chance. When clouds broke for a moment, he raised his sextant, taking a quick sight of the sun. With frozen fingers, he scribbled calculations, steadying himself as the boat heaved. Each observation was a victory, guiding them ever closer to South Georgia. Shackleton later said that Worsley's navigational skill saved us. And indeed, in such a tiny vessel on such a vast ocean, the margin for error was nearly non-existent. The seas were merciless. Gales hammered them, waves like moving mountains rose all around. Often, the men believed the next breaker would be their last. Shackleton stood at the tiller for hour upon hour, guiding the boat's stern into the waves, coaxing the Caird to rise rather than roll. At times, snow fell so heavily that the world seemed to vanish. At others, the spray froze on their beards and clothing, turning them into statues of ice. Vincent and McCarthy, the seamen, bailed constantly, scooping water with buckets, their arms aching. Crean tended the Primus stove, coaxing it to life even in the wet and wind, producing hot drinks that revived them in their darkest hours. McNish, though suffering, kept his strength for repairs, patching leaks and adjusting the rigging as needed. Sleep came only in snatches, when exhaustion overpowered misery. They lay wedged together under the low canvas, bodies stiff and sore, clothes never dry, boots frozen hard. Sometimes the ballast shifted, rolling stones against them, bruising flesh and threatening to pierce the hull. At night, the cold was bone deep, and the sound of the sea crashing endlessly about them was both terrifying and strangely hypnotic. Yet Shackleton's presence was a constant anchor. He spoke to each man, encouraged them, reminded them of the comrades waiting on Elephant Island. "We must reach South Georgia," he would say, "for their lives depend on us." His calm certainty became a light in the storm. On the 10th day, they sighted seaweed and birds, signs of land. Spirits rose, yet the weather worsened. For days more they battled headwinds and snow squalls, progressed slow and painful. The Caird seemed barely to crawl across the endless gray expanse. Still, Worsley's calculations held true on May 8th. After 16 harrowing days and nearly 800 miles, they glimpsed the dark outline of cliffs through the mist. South Georgia. The island loomed like salvation, though the ocean still raged between them and its shores. Reaching it was no simple matter. The seas crashed violently against the south coast, sheer cliffs rising straight from the water, with no beach to land upon. The little boat, tossed like a toy, could not approach. Shackleton realized they must skirt the island to the east, seeking a bay on the northern side where the whaling stations lay. But the men were at the end of their strength. Their hands were raw, their faces hollow, their clothes stiff with salt and ice. For 2 more days, they fought their way around the island, sails ragged, bodies failing. At last, on May 10th, they found a small inlet on the south coast, known as King Haakon Bay. There, with a final effort, they steered the Caird through the surf and grounded her on a narrow strip of beach. The men staggered ashore, their legs trembling, their faces gaunt. For a long time, they simply lay on the stones, unable to move. They had done the impossible, crossed the most dangerous seas in a tiny lifeboat, guided only by faith, skill, and unyielding will. The James Caird voyage stands as one of the greatest small boat journeys ever made. But for Shackleton and his men, it was not the end. They were still stranded on the uninhabited side of South Georgia, separated from help by mountains no man had ever crossed. Behind them, on Elephant Island, 22 comrades still waited, counting the days. Shackleton knew his task was not yet complete. He looked at Worsley, at Crean, at the weary men around him, and then at the jagged peaks that cut the sky. "We must cross the island," he said quietly. The journey of endurance was not over. It had only entered its next stage. Part 15. Salvation and Elidisawai. The James Caird had made landfall, battered but afloat. Yet Shackleton's ordeal was not finished. He, Worsley, and Tom Crean now faced the impossible. Crossing the uncharted mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, a place no human had ever traversed. There was no time to wait. Their clothes were soaked, their bodies worn thin, and their comrades were still stranded far behind on Elephant Island. Without hesitation, the 3 men began their climb. For 36 continuous hours, they moved through a landscape of ice and stone, navigating cliffs by the dim glow of the moon and the faint glimmer of stars. They had no tents, no sleeping bags, only a small stove and iron determination. Exhaustion gnawed at them, but they pressed on, knowing that rest might mean death. At last, on the morning of May 20th, 1916, Shackleton and his companions descended into Stromness whaling station. The workers there stared in disbelief at the ragged figures who stumbled toward them, bearded, frostbitten, and hollow-eyed. The nightmare was over, at least for the 3 who had made it through. But Shackleton's heart was not at rest. 22 of his men were still clinging to life on Elephant Island. Over the next 4 months, he mounted 4 separate rescue attempts, each one turned back by the pack ice. Yet he refused to give up. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, Shackleton returned aboard a Chilean vessel, the Yelcho. As the fog lifted, the men on Elephant Island saw their commander standing tall at the bow. Shackleton called out, "Are you all well?" The answer came back, "All safe, all well." Not a single life had been lost. In an age when explorers were often measured by how far they could push into the unknown, Shackleton was remembered for something rarer: his unyielding devotion to the lives of his men. He had not conquered Antarctica, but he had conquered despair. Years later, Shackleton would lead one final expedition south. In January 1922, he died suddenly aboard ship in South Georgia, the very island where he had once found salvation. He was buried there, beneath the cold peaks and restless seas that had defined his life. Today, Shackleton's legacy endures. His story is retold not only as an epic of exploration, but as a testament to leadership, resilience, and the human spirit's capacity to endure against impossible odds. And more than a century later, in March 2022, explorers rediscovered the wreck of the Endurance, preserved deep beneath the ice. The ship's name still gleamed across her bow, a silent reminder of the journey that had once tested and proved the limits of human endurance. Sparkles thus ends the saga of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance, a story of failure turned into triumph, of peril turned into hope, of a leader who brought every one of his men home alive. That's where today's story ends. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again in the next exciting adventure. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the newest videos. Thanks again for your support.